Marcus Blackwood froze in the marble doorway of his penthouse kitchen, his hand still gripping the crystal tumbler of 30-year-old scotch as he watched Eleanor Rodriguez attempt to hide the purple fingerprints wrapped around her throat with a silk scarf. The woman who had kept his empire running flawlessly for 3 years was trembling as she reached for the coffee beans, her movements careful and calculated, like someone afraid their next step might shatter glass. The same woman who had fearlessly negotiated million-dollar deals on his behalf and stared down hostile board members without blinking was now flinching at the sound of her own footsteps on his Italian marble floors. Marcus had built a fortune worth $12 billion by reading people, by seeing what others missed, and what he saw in Elena's reflection in the chrome surface of his refrigerator made his blood run cold. Elena had no idea he was watching her. She thought she was alone in the pre-dawn darkness of his kitchen, just as she had been every morning for the past month when she arrived 2 hours early to prepare his day. What she didn't know was that Marcus had been unable to sleep, haunted by quarterly reports that showed someone was systematically bleeding his company dry from the inside. He had come downstairs for coffee and found instead a truth that hit him harder than any corporate betrayal ever could. The woman who managed his life with military precision, who remembered his mother's birthday when he forgot it himself, who had somehow become the one constant in his ruthless world, was being destroyed by someone and hiding it behind the same professional mask she wore to board meetings. 3 weeks earlier, Elena had been different. Marcus remembered it clearly because Elena was never different. She was the definition of consistency in his chaotic world. She had walked into his office that Tuesday morning with the usual stack of prioritized messages, his preferred coffee temperature exactly right, and the quarterly projections he needed for the afternoon investor meeting. But something in her spine was straighter, something in her voice was tighter, and when she handed him his phone, her sleeve had ridden up just enough to reveal what looked like finger-shaped bruises on her wrist. Marcus had noticed because noticing details was how he had clawed his way out of the Chicago slums where he was born and built an empire that made grown men tremble. When he asked if everything was all right, Elena had smiled that same professional smile she gave difficult clients and assured him everything was perfect, just as she always did. But Marcus Blackwood had not become one of the most feared men in corporate America by accepting surface answers, and something about Elena's too-perfect composure had been eating at him ever since. Marcus set his scotch down on the counter with deliberate silence and stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, watching as Eleanor continued her morning routine with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions while their mind was somewhere else entirely. She was wearing a high-necked sweater in July, paired with long sleeves despite the summer heat, and every movement seemed designed to keep as much of her skin covered as possible. The Elena he knew wore sharp blazers and confident stride, commanded respect from men twice her size, and never, ever showed weakness. This Elena moved like she was trying to disappear, and Marcus realized with a clarity that cut through him like a blade that someone had been systematically breaking the strongest person he knew, piece by carefully hidden piece. Elena had started working for Marcus when his previous assistant quit after 6 months, claiming she could not handle the pressure of his demanding schedule and explosive temper. The employment agency had warned Elena that Marcus Blackwood went through assistance like other men went through shoes, that he was brilliant but ruthless, successful but impossible to please. Elena had walked into his corner office on the 48th floor, wearing a dress that cost less than his lunch, but carrying herself like she owned the building, looked him straight in the eye, and told him she was not afraid of hard work or difficult men, because she had been dealing with both her entire life. Marcus had hired her on the spot, not because he thought she would last longer than the others, but because something in her steady gaze reminded him of his own reflection during those early years, when he had fought his way out of poverty through sheer determination and carefully controlled rage. Within 3 months, Elena had reorganized his entire operation with an efficiency that impressed even Marcus. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them, managed his calendar with strategic precision that maximized his productivity, and handled his clients with a perfect balance of respect and authority that smoothed over his more abrasive tendencies. But more than that, Eleanor had become the one person in his world who was not afraid to tell him the truth, even when the truth was something he did not want to hear. When he was pushing too hard on a deal that would ultimately cost more than it gained, Elena would quietly place alternative options on his desk with research that proved her point. When his temper threatened to destroy important relationships, Elena would appear with exactly the right words to diffuse the situation without making him look weak. She had become indispensable in ways that went far beyond professional competence, and Marcus had never fully realized how much he depended on her steady presence until he started seeing it crack. The first real warning sign had been 3 weeks ago when Elena called in sick for the first time in her entire employment. Marcus had been irritated because he had a crucial merger meeting that day, and Elena knew his presentation better than he did. But when she returned the next morning, something fundamental had shifted. She was still efficient, still professional, still anticipating his needs with uncanny accuracy. But there was a new quality to her stillness that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of the way prey animals moved when they sensed a predator nearby. Elena had always been composed, but this was different. This was the kind of careful control that came from fear rather than confidence. Marcus had noticed because reading people was his greatest weapon in business, but he had not acted on his observations because Elena was an employee, and he had learned long ago that personal involvement with employees led to complications that could destroy carefully built empires. But watching Elena now, seeing her careful movements and hidden bruises, Marcus realized that some complications were worth the risk, and some lines were worth crossing when the alternative was standing by, while someone destroyed the only person in his world who had ever looked at him and seen something worth protecting instead of something to be feared. Elena had covered for him during board meetings when exhaustion made him sharp-edged and dangerous. She had worked 18-hour days during the Henderson acquisition without complaint. She had been there during his father's funeral when grief had made him almost human, and she had never once used his moments of vulnerability against him the way everyone else in his world eventually did. Elena had earned his trust through 3 years of unwavering loyalty, and Marcus was beginning to understand that loyalty should flow both ways. Marcus pulled out his phone and sent a text to his head of security, David Kim, asking him to come to the penthouse immediately without alerting anyone else. David had worked for Marcus for 5 years and had seen enough corporate warfare to know when something serious was happening without needing detailed explanations. Within 20 minutes, David was standing in Marcus's study, his expression alert and ready for whatever crisis required his immediate attention. Marcus closed the door and turned to face the man who had helped him navigate threats from hostile takeovers to death threats from disgruntled investors. But this time, the threat was personal, and Marcus was not entirely sure how to proceed without destroying the very person he was trying to protect. Marcus told David what he had observed, keeping his voice level and professional despite the rage building in his chest like pressure behind a dam. David listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively darker as Marcus described Elena's changed behavior. The covered bruises, the way she flinched at unexpected sounds. When Marcus finished, David was quiet for a long moment before asking the question Marcus had been dreading. Who did Marcus think was responsible, and what exactly did he want David to do about it? Marcus realized he did not know the answer to either question. which was an unfamiliar and deeply unsettling position for a man who built his empire on having all the information and controlling every variable. Elena had never mentioned a boyfriend or husband during her employment. Marcus knew she lived alone in a small apartment in Queens, that she sent money to her mother in El Salvador every month, and that she had worked her way through college while supporting her younger sister. He knew these things because they had appeared on her employment background check, but he realized now that he knew almost nothing about her personal life or the people in it. Elena maintained perfect professional boundaries, never sharing details about her relationships or personal struggles, never asking for special favors or time off for personal matters. Marcus had appreciated her discretion and professionalism, but now that same discretion was preventing him from identifying the threat and eliminating it with his usual corporate efficiency. David suggested they start with surveillance, placing Elena under discreet protection to identify her attacker and gather evidence of the abuse. But Marcus rejected that approach immediately because surveillance meant watching Elena be hurt while they gathered information, and the thought of allowing even one more bruise to appear on her skin made Marcus want to put his fist through the wall of his study. David then suggested confronting Elena directly, asking her to trust them with the truth so they could help her. But Marcus knew Elena well enough to predict that she would deny everything, protect her attacker through some misguided sense of loyalty or fear, and probably resign rather than allow her personal problems to affect her professional responsibilities. Elena's strength was also her weakness, and her determination to handle everything alone was going to get her killed if Marcus did not find another way to intervene. The solution came to Marcus with the same sudden clarity that marked his best business decisions. Elena had been arriving 2 hours early every morning, which meant she was avoiding her home during the hours when her attacker was most likely to be there. She was covering bruises and flinching at sounds, which meant the abuse was escalating and becoming more frequent. Elena was trapped between her need to escape her attacker and her determination to maintain her professional responsibilities, and Marcus realized he could use her dedication against the situation by creating a professional reason for her to stay safe. He would offer Elena a live-in position, managing his household and personal affairs from the security of his penthouse, with a salary increase that would justify the change and make it impossible for her to refuse without seeming ungrateful or unprofessional. Marcus spent the rest of the morning crafting the perfect offer, one that would sound like a logical business expansion rather than a rescue operation. Elena already managed his professional schedule with perfect efficiency, so expanding her responsibilities to include his personal life and household management was a natural progression. The salary increase would be substantial enough to help Elena gain financial independence from whoever was controlling her, and the live-in arrangement would place her under the constant protection of Marcus's security team without making it obvious that she was being protected. Marcus had built his fortune by making other people's weaknesses work to his advantage, and now he was going to use those same skills to save the person who had become far more important to him than any employee should ever be. When Elena arrived at the office that morning, Marcus was waiting with coffee already prepared and a carefully rehearsed speech about expanding her role in his organization. Elena listened with her usual professional attention as Marcus explained that his increasing business commitments required someone he trusted to manage his personal affairs with the same efficiency she brought to his corporate responsibilities. The position would include overseeing his household staff, managing his social calendar, and ensuring that his personal life supported, rather than interfered, with his business objectives. Elena's expression remained perfectly controlled as Marcus outlined the substantial salary increase and the live-in arrangement that would allow her to be available for the irregular hours his lifestyle demanded. But Marcus was watching Elena's hands as he spoke, And he saw the moment when she realized what he was actually offering her. Her fingers stopped their nervous movement against the fabric of her sleeve, and for just an instant, her professional mask slipped enough for Marcus to see the desperate hope she was trying to hide. Elena asked several clarifying questions about the position, each one designed to confirm that this was a legitimate business offer rather than charity disguised as employment. Marcus answered each question with the same professional detachment he would use for any personnel decision, making it clear that he was offering the position because Elena's skills made her uniquely qualified, not because he pitied her personal situation. When Elena finally accepted the position, her voice was steady and grateful, but Marcus saw her hands shake with relief as she signed the new employment contract. Elena moved into the guest wing of Marcus's penthouse that same weekend, bringing only 2 small suitcases and a worn leather portfolio that contained her personal documents. Marcus had expected her to need time to pack up her apartment and arrange for the transition, but Elena seemed eager to complete the move as quickly as possible, which confirmed Marcus's suspicion that her living situation had become dangerous enough to make his offer feel like salvation rather than simply career advancement. Marcus made sure to be out of the penthouse during Elena's move, giving her space to settle in without feeling like he was monitoring her transition. But David reported that Elena had spent her first night in the guest wing sleeping on the floor beside the locked door, rather than in the comfortable bed they had provided. Over the following weeks, Marcus watched Elena slowly begin to relax into her new environment like a wild animal, learning to trust that the trap was actually sanctuary. She continued to perform her professional duties with the same efficiency he had always appreciated, but gradually the careful movements and hidden flinches began to disappear. Elena started wearing clothes that fit properly, instead of oversized sweaters designed to conceal bruises. She began speaking in her natural voice, instead of the carefully modulated tone she had adopted to avoid triggering anger. Most importantly, Elena stopped looking over her shoulder every time she entered a room, and the constant vigilance that had marked her behavior for months slowly gave way to something that resembled peace. Marcus had not expected rescuing Elena to change his own life, but living with her in his carefully controlled penthouse environment revealed aspects of her personality that had been hidden beneath her professional composure. Elena sang softly in Spanish while she prepared coffee in the mornings, her voice carrying melodies that spoke of warmth and family traditions that had nothing to do with corporate efficiency. She left small touches throughout his sterile living space that somehow made it feel more like a home than a fortress. Fresh flowers in simple vases and books left open on tables as if someone actually lived there instead of just sleeping between business obligations. Elena moved through his space with unconscious grace, bringing life to rooms that had never felt alive despite their expensive furnishings and perfect design. But the most significant change was the way Elena looked at Marcus himself, as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time, instead of viewing him through the lens of professional necessity. Elena had always been respectful and competent, but now she was also genuinely relaxed in his presence, asking questions about his childhood and expressing opinions about his business decisions with a directness that was refreshing after years of calculated corporate conversations. Marcus found himself looking forward to their morning coffee discussions and evening debriefings in ways that had nothing to do with business efficiency and everything to do with the simple pleasure of being understood by someone who had no hidden agenda or ulterior motives. 3 months after Elena moved into the penthouse, Marcus's head of security brought him information that changed everything he thought he understood about Elena's situation. David had finally identified Elena's attacker through careful investigation of her previous living arrangements and personal history. The man was Elena's stepfather, Ramon Torres, who had been abusing Elena financially and physically since her mother's death 2 years earlier. Ramon had been using Elena's guilt about her mother's medical bills and her sense of family obligation to maintain control over her income and living situation, taking most of her salary while subjecting her to increasingly violent abuse whenever she showed signs of independence or resistance. David's investigation revealed that Ramon had been calling Elena's workplace repeatedly, demanding to know where she was living and threatening to report her to immigration authorities if she did not return home immediately. Marcus read David's report with the same cold fury that had driven him during his most ruthless business campaigns, but this time the stakes were personal in ways that made his usual calculated approach feel inadequate. Ramon Torres was threatening the person who had become the center of Marcus's carefully ordered world, and Marcus realized that his feelings for Eleanor had evolved far beyond professional appreciation into something that demanded protection at any cost. Marcus had destroyed corporations and ruined careers for lesser offenses than what Ramon had done to Elena, but this situation required more than his usual corporate warfare tactics, because Elena's safety and well-being were more important than his need for revenge. Marcus made 2 phone calls that afternoon, both to people who owed him favors substantial enough to ensure their complete cooperation without questions or complications. The first call was to Detective Sarah Hoffman of the NYPD, who had benefited from Marcus's anonymous tips about corporate fraud cases that had advanced her career significantly. Marcus provided Detective Hoffman with David's complete investigation file, including photographic evidence of Elena's injuries and documented proof of Ramon's financial abuse and immigration threats. Detective Hoffman assured Marcus that Ramon Torres would be arrested within 48 hours on charges that would ensure he spent significant time in prison and would never be able to threaten Elena again. The second call was to immigration attorney Jennifer Walsh, who had successfully defended several of Marcus's employees against deportation attempts by using Marcus's considerable political connections and legal resources. Marcus explained Elena's situation and asked Jennifer to ensure that Elena's immigration status was completely secure and that Ramon's threats were legally meaningless. Jennifer promised to expedite Elena's permanent residency application using channels that would provide her with unassailable legal protection within weeks rather than the usual years such applications required. Marcus was prepared to use every connection and spend whatever amount was necessary to ensure that Elena never again had to fear anyone who threatened her safety or security. When Detective Hoffman called 2 days later to confirm Ramon Torres's arrest, Marcus felt the same satisfaction he experienced when closing particularly challenging business deals, but magnified by the knowledge that Elena was finally safe from the person who had been destroying her piece by piece. Marcus decided not to tell Elena about his involvement in Ramon's arrest, allowing her to believe that justice had finally caught up with her stepfather through normal police work rather than through Marcus's intervention. Elena deserved to feel that she had survived her ordeal through her own strength rather than feeling indebted to Marcus for rescuing her. And Marcus was learning that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was use their power invisibly to protect someone they cared about. Elena's relief when she learned about Ramon's arrest was visible in every aspect of her behavior, from the way her shoulders finally relaxed to the genuine smile that replaced her professional mask during their daily interactions. Elena began to talk about her plans for the future, about finishing her business degree and perhaps starting her own consulting firm someday, dreams that had been impossible when most of her income was going to Ramon and her time was consumed by fear. Marcus listened to Elena's aspirations with growing realization that helping her achieve her goals had become more important to him than advancing his own ambitions. A shift in priorities that should have alarmed him, but instead felt like the most natural progression in the world. 6 months after Elena moved into the penthouse, Marcus found himself restructuring his entire business approach around the possibility of Elena becoming his equal partner rather than his employee. Elena's insights into his corporate strategies had always been valuable, but now Marcus was actively seeking her opinions on major decisions and incorporating her suggestions into his long-term planning. Elena had a perspective on ethical business practices that challenged Marcus's more ruthless instincts, while still maintaining the aggressive approach necessary for success in their competitive industry. Working with Elena was teaching Marcus that power could be used to build rather than simply to dominate, and that the greatest victories came from elevating others rather than crushing them. But the most significant change was not professional but personal, the gradual recognition that Elena had become the most important person in Marcus's world, and that his feelings for her had developed far beyond anything appropriate for an employer and employee relationship. Marcus had spent his adult life avoiding emotional attachments that could be used as weapons against him. But Elena had somehow slipped past all his defenses by never trying to manipulate or control him, by offering loyalty without expecting anything in return, by seeing his potential for goodness even when he could not see it himself. Elena had made Marcus want to become worthy of her respect and affection, and that desire was transforming him into a version of himself that he had never imagined was possible. The evening when Marcus finally acknowledged his feelings for Elena began like any other, with them sharing dinner in his private dining room while discussing the details of an upcoming merger that would expand his company into international markets. But as Elena explained her research into the cultural considerations that would determine the success of their European expansion, Marcus found himself watching the way lamplight caught the gold highlights in her dark hair and thinking about how empty his life had been before she became part of it. When Elena noticed his distraction and asked if something was wrong, Marcus realized that pretending his feelings were purely professional was becoming impossible and ultimately unfair to both of them. Marcus told Elena the truth about his investigation into her abuse and his role in Ramon's arrest, explaining that his initial motivation had been protective rather than romantic, but that somewhere during the process of ensuring her safety, he had fallen in love with the woman who had trusted him enough to accept his help. Elena listened without interruption, her expression shifting from surprise to understanding, to something that looked remarkably like relief, as if she had been waiting for Marcus to acknowledge what had been growing between them for months. When Marcus finished his explanation, Elena smiled and told him that she had suspected his involvement in Ramon's arrest because she knew Marcus well enough to recognize his particular brand of protective efficiency, and that her feelings for him had been developing alongside her growing sense of safety and security in his presence. Elena told Marcus that she had been afraid to acknowledge her feelings because she did not want him to think she was grateful rather than genuinely attracted to him, that she needed him to know her affection was based on who he was rather than what he had done for her. Elena explained that watching Marcus use his power to protect rather than dominate had shown her aspects of his character that made her fall in love with the man behind the corporate reputation, and that she wanted to build something real with him if he was willing to risk the vulnerability that genuine partnership required. Marcus had never imagined that someone could love him for his capacity for goodness rather than his capacity for destruction. But Elena was offering him exactly that kind of transformative affection. Their first kiss happened in the soft light of Marcus's dining room, gentle and careful and full of the promise of something that could last beyond the initial intensity of rescue and gratitude. Elena tasted like the wine they had shared with dinner and the future they were brave enough to build together. And Marcus realized that all his corporate victories paled in comparison to the simple miracle of being truly known and accepted by someone whose opinion mattered more than his profit margins. Elena's hands were steady against his chest, no longer trembling with fear, but warm with affection and trust. And Marcus understood that the greatest empire he could ever build was the life he and Elena could create together. 1 year later, Marcus surprised Elena with a proposal that managed to incorporate both his business acumen and his understanding of what mattered most to her. Instead of a traditional engagement ring, Marcus presented Elena with ownership papers for the consulting firm he had established in her name, complete with startup capital and her first major client contract with his own company. Elena would have the independence and professional recognition she had always wanted, while Marcus would have the partnership and collaboration he had never known he needed. Elena's acceptance came with tears of joy and laughter that filled Marcus's penthouse with more happiness than all his financial success had ever provided. The wedding was small and elegant, attended by the people who had become their chosen family rather than the society connections that usually populated Marcus's public events. Elena wore her mother's pearl necklace and carried flowers that reminded her of her childhood in El Salvador, while Marcus wore his father's watch and carried a photograph of his parents in his pocket, honoring the people who had shaped them into individuals capable of building something beautiful together. Elena's sister flew in from college, where her tuition was now paid by a scholarship fund Marcus had established anonymously, and Marcus's mentor from his early business days served as his best man, symbolizing the journey that had brought him from ruthless ambition to the kind of success measured in love rather than stock prices. During their honeymoon in Elena's homeland, Marcus met the extended family whose financial support had been Elena's responsibility for so many years, and understood fully why Elena's loyalty ran so deep and true. Elena's relatives welcomed Marcus with warmth that had nothing to do with his wealth and everything to do with Elena's obvious happiness and security. And Marcus experienced for the first time what it meant to be valued for his character rather than his achievements. Elena showed Marcus the small house where she had grown up, the school where she had excelled despite limited resources, and the church where her mother was buried, sharing the foundation of strength and determination that had shaped her into the woman who could transform even someone as guarded as Marcus. 5 years after that morning, when Marcus first saw Elena hiding Bruises in his kitchen, they stood together in the boardroom of Torres Rivera Consulting, the company that had grown from Elena's initial firm into a major player in ethical business development, with offices in 3 countries. Elena was presenting their latest project to a room full of corporate executives, her confidence and expertise commanding respect that had nothing to do with her connection to Marcus and everything to do with her own brilliance and hard work. Marcus watched from the back of the room, remembering the frightened woman who had once flinched at unexpected sounds, and marveled at the transformation that came from being truly seen and completely supported by someone who loved her enough to help her become her best self. The presentation Elena was giving focused on their newest initiative, a program that helped corporations identify and assist employees who were experiencing domestic abuse, providing resources and support that could save lives while maintaining the productivity and loyalty that benefited everyone involved. Elena had turned her own painful experience into a mission that had already helped hundreds of people escape dangerous situations and rebuild their lives with dignity and independence. Marcus had provided the initial funding and corporate connections, but Elena had developed the vision and strategy that made their program a model for companies around the world. After the presentation, as Elena fielded questions and scheduled follow-up meetings with executives eager to implement their program, Marcus reflected on the unexpected ways that protecting someone you love could end up transforming your entire understanding of what success actually meant. Marcus still ran his original company with the same strategic brilliance that had made him wealthy. But now, his business practices incorporated the ethical framework Elena had helped him develop, proving that compassion and profitability were not mutually exclusive when implemented with intelligence and commitment. Marcus had discovered that using his power to elevate others created a kind of sustainable success that was far more satisfying than anything he had achieved through dominance alone. That evening, as Marcus and Elena walked through Central Park near their penthouse, Elena told him about the letter she had received from a woman in Chicago whose life had been saved by their corporate assistance program. A story that reminded Marcus why their work mattered beyond the impressive profit margins and industry recognition they had achieved. Elena carried these stories with her always, each one representing a person who had found safety and hope through resources that might not have existed if Elena had not been brave enough to transform her pain into purpose. Marcus realized that Elena's greatest strength had never been her professional efficiency or her personal resilience, but her ability to use her own healing to create healing for others. As they reached the park bench, where they often sat to watch the sunset over the city that had witnessed their transformation from employer and employee to partners in every sense of the word, Marcus thought about the chain of events that had begun with his simple decision to pay attention to someone else's pain, instead of ignoring it for the sake of professional boundaries. That single moment of human connection had led to a life neither of them could have imagined when they were trapped in their separate forms of isolation. Elena by fear, and Marcus by the loneliness that came from being feared rather than truly known. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply witness someone else's struggle and refuse to look away, even when helping meant risking the comfortable distance that kept life predictable and safe. Elena leaned against Marcus's shoulder as they watched the lights begin to twinkle across Manhattan, and Marcus understood that the empire he had built with her was measured not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the lives they had touched and the love they had created together. Elena had taught him that true strength came not from the ability to crush others, but from the courage to be vulnerable enough to let someone else's welfare become as important as your own survival. Marcus had saved Elena from a dangerous situation, but Elena had saved Marcus from a life of isolation disguised as success, and together they had built something that would outlast any corporate legacy either of them could have achieved alone. The story of Marcus Blackwood and Elena Rodriguez became legendary in their industry, not because of their financial success or their innovative business practices, but because of the way they demonstrated that paying attention to each other's humanity could transform individual survival into shared thriving, and that sometimes the greatest victory came not from conquering others, but from having the courage to love someone enough to help them become everything they were meant to be. Their love story began with the simple act of noticing that someone was in pain and refusing to ignore that pain for the sake of convenience, proving that the most powerful force in any empire was the decision to see each other clearly and choose connection over indifference, even when such choices required risking everything they thought they knew about how power was supposed to work.